So we're going to do another cross. This time I'm going to tell you what we have to start with, and you are going to try to work through doing the cross yourself. We're going to use two pea plants, and I am going to use the flower color as the trait. If you look on your picture in the textbook, purple is the dominant flower color and white is the recessive flower color. So I'm going to say we have a heterozygous purple flower plant, and we're crossing it with a white flower plant. That would be a typical setup that would be given to you in the question. So, what should you do to solve this problem? Well, I think the first thing that you need to do is figure out what genotype that is. For each of those two parent plants, the purple one and the white one, what's the genotype of the plant? Then you need to figure out which gametes they can make. Then you do your cross. If you try to jump right to the cross, you will make a mistake sometimes, I would be willing to predict. Maybe not all the time. But if you don't take the time to figure out what you have to begin with first, it's way harder to figure out what you have in the end. So we're looking to predict what type of offspring these two plants could have. So start by thinking about what their genotype is. For the purple flower plant, I told you that it was heterozygous, so you can look at the definition of heterozygous. For the white flower plant, I did not say what its genotype was, and that was on purpose. White is recessive, and there's only one way you can have the recessive trait. So I'm just giving you those little clues to start with. I want to wait a couple minutes. So if you're unsure where to start, I will help you out. Heterozygous, by definition, means that you have two different alleles. Since for now, we're only talking about dominant and recessive, there's no other scenario, a heterozygous purple flower plant should have one dominant and one recessive allele. Now here's something that I like to make sure you all notice. Some letters, when they're capital, look the same as a lowercase letter. P is one of them. If you're going to use a P, that's fine, but I would recommend do what I did and really exaggerate the size of the two P's. Make the capital P look extra big and make the lowercase p look extra small. You are also welcome to use whatever letter you want to use. So if you want to choose a different letter, go ahead. But that's something that you should keep in mind because it's easy to make a mistake if your letters all look the same size. The white flower plant has the recessive trait. If I think about what complete dominance means, it means that if I have even one copy of the dominant allele, then I show the dominant trait. That means that to have a recessive trait, you have to have two copies of the recessive allele. That's the only way that it will work. So those are the genotypes of the parents. If you remember, the next step is to take the genotypes of the parents and ask yourself what possible gametes could those parents make, and to write them on the outside of your Punnett square. So I will put this parent on this side and this parent here. Now you might notice, before you start doing your cross, that on the top I have two different alleles, but on the side it looks like the same allele both times. So you don't have to do the same thing twice. You could just omit this section of the Punnett square because you're just going to be repeating yourself. And like I showed you yesterday, you would get the same result. 2 out of 4 and 1 out of 2 are the same thing. Next step is to do the cross. So I'm just going to fill in my Punnett square. That's what I would get if I filled it in. Those are genotypes. So I always like to add what the phenotype is. One out of the two boxes shows purple, the other shows white. So like Bryce said before, I would say 50% or maybe 0.50 is the probability of having purple, and 50% or 0.50 is the probability of having a white flower. Now, like I said the last time, unless the question specifies how to respond, 50% and 0.50 mean the same thing to me. They also mean the same thing as 1 out of 2. So unless the question indicates that you must answer as a percentage or that you must answer in a decimal number, you can answer in whatever form you want for the number. Does anyone want to ask questions about that example? Okay. So let's do another one. Let's do a homozygous green pod plant with a yellow pod plant. Still looking at Mendel's pea plants, the pod color is one of the other traits. So I'll help you get started if you're feeling stuck there. Otherwise, if you've got it, continue on. That's what I would write for the genotypes of the two plants. So if we take a look at these plants, I said the green pod plant was homozygous. Homo means the same, so that means they have 2 of the same allele. Green was the dominant allele, so I used a capital letter. Even though the other color was yellow, I didn't switch to a Y. It's not good practice to switch letters. And the reason is later we're going to add a second gene, and you're going to use different letters for different genes. So you don't want to start using different letters for the same gene. It gets too messy in your method. But with that said, this is just your method. This is not your final answer. But I would highly recommend always using the same letter for the same gene, capital for the dominant version, lowercase of the same letter for recessive. If you go to fill this in, you'll write the gametes. Gametes, remember, are half of what the parent has. And you'll say, I'm writing the same gamete twice for both of them. I should be able to just omit this section, don't want to do capital G twice, and I should be able to omit this section, don't want to do little g twice. So there's realistically only one outcome. All of the offspring should be heterozygous, and they should all have a green pod. So we would say 100% green pod or 0% yellow pod. Those would be the phenotypes that we would predict. Now remember, this is just a prediction. Predictions are based on probability. Yes? Sorry, I'm not sure what you're asking me. Oh, I see what you're saying. Like if this were a multiple choice question, what are the possibilities? Like realistically, the possibilities should be 0, 25, 50, 75, or 100. What you'll see though is a lot of the time it's not a multiple choice question, it's a numeric response question. So, but you're right, those should be the only percentages that you're giving for now. Once we get into this second set of problems where we start adding a second gene, then there'll be some of those in-between percentages. Anyone else want to ask anything there? Okay, we'll do one more. This time, I'm not going to tell you where we're starting. I'm going to tell you where we're ending, and I would like you to tell me where we started. So I'm going to tell you that in the end, there was a ratio of 3, which trait did I want here? Axial plants for every 1 terminal plant. So if you look at the table or you have it printed out, axial is the dominant trait, and top, or sorry, I should write top. Terminal or top is the recessive trait. It's asking the position of the flower. That's what it's talking about. And I gave you a ratio so that you could compare how many you had of each phenotype. Now, luckily, if you look at that ratio, 3 and 1, that adds up to 4. So what I'm saying is the 2 plants that we crossed ended up having 4 offspring or some multiple of 4 that I could make into a ratio. 3 of them were axial, and 1 of them had the flower position at the top. So I've given you the end result phenotypes. I would like you to go backwards and tell me what were the genotypes of the parents. Whenever I'm trying to figure out what the parents had to pass on to their offspring, it is my habit to always start with the recessive trait. This was the recessive trait. And the reason I start with the recessive trait is that I absolutely know what the genotype had to be. For all of those plants that had axial as their flower position, they could be homozygous for that dominant allele, or they could be heterozygous, and I don't actually know which one they are. But for that one plant in this 3-to-1 ratio that had the flower position on the top, I know that it had to have 2 copies of a recessive allele because it had a recessive trait. Yep. No, I'm saying for every 3 axial plants, there's 1 that's terminal. It should add up to 4, and then when we start doing a bigger one, it should add up to 16 because that'll be the size of the box. So if I look, I'm using a little a here because axial is the dominant trait. If you wanted to use little t's, like it's not a big deal which letter you use. So here's what I say to myself. Well, they had to get one of these from one parent and the other one from the other parent. They can't have gotten both of those recessive alleles from the same parent. Then I say to myself, okay, these other plants, the ones that are axial, they definitely have to have a copy of the dominant allele. I'm not necessarily sure what their second allele is, but I know that one of them has to be the dominant allele, or they wouldn't have that phenotype. So then I say, well, for this guy over here and this guy over here, they had to have gotten that capital letter from somewhere. Over here, I can see it didn't come from the box above. I already said that was the little a. So it had to come from over here. For this guy, right up there, I don't know about him, but this box down here, there's a little a. That means there had to have been a big A up here. So I started with the recessive trait because I know what its genotype was. Then I filled in the outside of my Punnett square based on that. Now that I've filled it in, I could fill in the rest of their genotypes, which would be like this. Now you will be expected to look at crosses both ways, both from the starting point with the parental generation, but also from the end point with the offspring. Yep, this would be one parent's genotype, and this would be the other parent's genotype. Because axial is the dominant trait. So we said incomplete dominance. Even if you only have one copy of the dominant allele, it's the trait that shows up. The little a will give us the top position, but axial is dominant over it, so we get the same visible trait. Now there's